Hey everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of our online class, Exploring the World of the Gospels. I appreciate you all tuning in, although I'm not sure tuning in is the appropriate phrase anymore. Does that still work in digital class? Kind of like when you say dialed, when you call a cell phone. Anyway, but just like the first three sessions, I am still Pete. That hasn't changed yet. And I'm your guide on this exploration of the ancient land and people of the New Testament. I even have a nice khaki safari shirt on to go with it. So there you go. So far we've looked at the importance of learning the historical and cultural context of the Jewish people. We took a high-level flyover over their ancient history, leading all the way up to the time of Jesus. Then last week we talked about the three core beliefs of these people, the beliefs that ultimately formed and directed their lives. We saw how their belief in one God, called monotheism, meant that the one true God wanted their complete loyalty and devotion, to be loved wholeheartedly. And that this one God made an agreement, what was called a covenant, that if they would worship and follow him alone, they would be tremendously blessed and made into a great nation with an abundant land to call their own. And they would be a light to the world. If they didn't, they would lose it all. It's an agreement, which, as we saw from their history before, was what happened, right? Kind of up and down and losing everything. And we ended with talking about how God actually told them how to practice loyalty to him, how to obey his law called the Torah, the actual written list of God-given instructions. Obeying Torah was loving God and being a faithful, loyal Jew. And so that was the backbone, the foundational worldview that all Jews held in tension with those they lived around and with themselves. They had to now wrestle with what exactly it meant to obey the Torah. It demanded a lot, and sometimes it was confusing, right? People needed help understanding it, and sometimes encouragement to follow it, sometimes forceful encouragement. For what about Jews who didn't obey Torah? What happened if a Jewish person thought the Roman way of life was more attractive? Because the Roman way of life, the Greek way of life, was completely contrary to a lot of the teachings of Torah. And they would say, we're a people, we're a nation that is either blessed or cursed. So is that unfaithful person ruining it for the rest of us? Are we being graded on a curve here? Does one bad apple mess up our whole nation? And I just want you to notice, even in that question again, how today we often see our religion as a very personal, individual thing. It's all about you and Jesus and your own afterlife. But for the Jews, loyalty to God and obeying the covenant agreement wasn't just personal, it was national. It was about all of us together. Now that doesn't mean there is no personal motivation. Everyone wanted to have a blessed life. They all wanted to live in the age to come when God would restore all things. So what happens if you follow it with all your heart, but you don't live to see that? What if you die and never see any of those promises? What about the people who aren't obeying? What if I'm not perfect, right? We had all these kind of questions. What would it mean to live as a loyal person in the first century with all of these questions? And so that's what we're diving into. And what I want to do today is dive even deeper into what obeying Torah would have looked like. How living a life of loyalty to the covenant played out for the average person, as well as those tasked with the levels of leadership. And how people thought about and dealt with some of those questions we were left with last week about failure, the disloyal, right? And ultimately what happens to the righteous who don't see the blessing. How did it impact what I would just say is their daily life? What does life look like under Torah? Now, of course, there's no way I can give an exhaustive list and cover everything in such a short time like this. You wouldn't want to anyway, you'd be bored. It could be a whole course by itself. But I want to offer a few key elements. I want to paint with broad strokes and just give us a picture, an idea of what it was like to live under Torah. Fair enough? All right. The best place to start is with that first commandment. Love the Lord your God and worship him alone. As we've already touched on, there was a general view that at its core, to love and worship God was to obey God. We see this all the way back in 1 Samuel 15:22, when the prophet comes and asks King Saul, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed better than the fat of rams. So that's an interesting thing. All right, first, this verse is important because it highlights a necessary component of our understanding of worship that I want to explain a bit to you. He's talking about obeying, but he's talking about more, because Samuel isn't giving directives on how to worship God here. He's just pointing out that any form of worship is useless if it's not ultimately about obeying God. That's the most important thing, obeying God, being loyal. For some context, though, for this verse, God gave King Saul instructions about going into a battle and told him, don't keep any of what are the common spoils of war when you win, like the cattle and the sheep. I want you to destroy it all, God said. That's kind of weird. This isn't the time or place for us to get into why, unfortunately. It's a different class. But what we see is that Saul decides to keep the best animals. And when asked by the prophet, why did you keep them? He says this, I spared the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. Which leads the prophet to say, whoa, obedience is better than sacrifice. What's going on here? Obedience and sacrifice. What's happening? Here's something that I want you to understand about their world. And it plays throughout the whole Bible. When you hear the word worship in the Old Testament, and oftentimes in the New as well, be careful that you don't let your mind run to a picture of all these Jewish people hanging out in a big auditorium with a rocking band and a smoke machine, all singing a powerful bridge for the 19th time in a row. Worship, right? You need to understand that in the ancient world, the concept of worship always centered around sacrifice. And this was no different for the Jews, especially men like Saul. Offering sacrifice for the Jews and the ancient people was one of the primary elements of living under Torah. And while this is kind of out there for us, no one viewed it as strange or odd then. It was just a normal part of their lives. So we need to understand it a little bit better, I think. Because here's Saul saying, well, I'm giving this as a sacrifice. And Samuel's saying, no, I want obedience. What? Okay, first off, almost all forms of sacrifice involved an animal. They were killed, slaughtered, right, butchered. This was what happened. They would be cut up for distribution. Some would be taken by a priest. We'll get into that, which is how they ate. And then blood would be sprinkled on an altar, and they would burn the fat as a form of worship. Sometimes the whole sacrifice would be completely burned up and wasted, where we get the word Holocaust, something completely burned up. Sometimes you or your son could come and bring the animal and cut the animal's throat yourself while the priest would hold it, and we'll get into all this. This would have been a powerful, visceral moment and very bloody. I keep telling Kyle, our worship pastor, that one of these days he has to just stop one of his songs, bring out a goat, and let's have a real worship service right there on the stage. I'm pretty sure people would run screaming, but it would be biblical, okay? Just staying true to the Bible. Of course, our most common question today is simply this: why? What's with all the killing? Well, as I said a few times now in this class, there's some things we can't dive into. We're looking at the world, we're not looking at theology. This can be very deep. But I do want to touch on this as much as I can. And you can also come to my Rise to Life class where I go a bit deeper. I want to say two things about sacrifice that are important. The first is this. One of our questions about following Torah was, what happens if you fail? What if you accidentally break a law without even realizing it? Or worse, you just straight up do something you know is wrong, because let's face it, we all do that, right? Okay, this is partly what sacrifice was about for the people. Blood had a great significance as it represented life. It belonged to the Lord. It was a life within us. So the shedding of innocent blood sometimes represented the price paid for our failure or disobedience. So a sacrifice was a way of us saying, I'm sorry, basically. And they had two specific situations for this, two sacrifices. One was called the sin offering, where you could atone or make up for an accidental sin. I did this by mistake, but I still want to say I'm sorry. Another was called the guilt offering, where you would offer a sacrifice to make up for an intentional break of the law. I knew I wasn't supposed to, I did it anyway, I'm sorry, right? So the Jewish people didn't believe they had to perfectly follow the law without any mistakes. That doesn't make any sense. They didn't think that. The Torah itself understood human weakness. And within its actual pages, it offered the way for people to show loyalty and love for God even when they made mistakes and they failed. The Torah knew you were going to make mistakes. I like to say it kind of like this. The most important thing in a marriage is faithfulness. A marriage simply won't work if the two people don't choose to love and be loyal, right? However, that doesn't mean perfection. You can be a loyal spouse and not a perfect spouse. We all make mistakes. So it can't also work if there's no way to ever forgive and move on from past mistakes. You can be loyal and still flawed. That's just life. And it was the same with the Jews. They could be loyal and love God and still make mistakes. They didn't have to follow it perfectly. And one way to do that was through sacrifice. Fortunately for me, I only have to buy my wife flowers, not slaughter a goat in the kitchen, which would be a whole other thing. Now, it's important to also know that this did not mean every time someone made a mistake, they ran and killed an animal. Hardly at all, actually. That was kind of rare. That would have been crazy anyway. There wouldn't have been enough animals in the world for that to happen, much less time in someone's life to be constantly killing an animal. Rather, the Torah offered a general, bigger way to essentially deal with everyone, all of Israel at once, called Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. On this one day every year, they'd have a huge gathering, practice this ceremony as outlined in the Torah, and it would essentially cover and forgive all the people for the entire year. This was how most Jews would have understood their relationship to God and sacrifice. As long as I strive to do my best and I set my heart on being loyal to God, I can make mistakes here and there, and they'll be covered on the Day of Atonement. Sometimes I may do something extra egregious, or I have a guilty conscience, and I just really want to go to God and say, God, I'm really sorry, and I can offer a special sin or guilt offering. But the idea of atoning for sin was ultimately on the Day of Atonement, not in killing animals. So wait, you might be asking, if most Jews found forgiveness and atonement on Yom Kippur, does that mean sacrifices were rare? Not at all. They were happening all the time. Literally, all the time, sun up to sundown. But for reasons other than we often understand or associate with. You see, sacrifice wasn't primarily about sin, it was primarily about worship. The surviving literature we have from the time suggests that most sacrifices were not seen as atoning the way that we often think, or trying to find forgiveness. That wasn't the common thing, but simply as gifts meant to honor and celebrate God. Sometimes it was about appeasement. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. More often than not, though, it was thanksgiving and praise and celebration. You'd bring this valuable animal to God. And as a way of communicating to yourself, to others, that God was worthy of all things, you would offer it up to him. And this wasn't a sad, somber occasion. They would come singing, rejoicing. Sacrifice was part of the command to love God with all you have, including your strength, which spoke of your wealth and possessions. So sacrificing an animal was giving your strength. And just think of this. What happened to the extra meat from the sacrifice after the priest would take their share? You kept it. And what did you do with it? Well, you'd take it home and you would have a huge celebration. You would have a party because meat was very rare. It was a treat. You didn't eat a lot of it. So a sacrifice was a joyous time that you'd invite friends and neighbors. You'd go to the temple, you'd sacrifice, you'd praise God, and you'd come home and have a party. And most only did this a few times a year. Those who live far away, maybe once if possible. But it was a joyous event that people looked forward to. There's a story about a father whose son comes home and says, "This son of mine was lost and now is found. Go and slaughter the fattened calf. We're going to honor God and we're going to celebrate." It's about worship. It's about loving God. Now there's also another side to sacrifice that gets a bit deeper. And it deals with what it means to be clean. But to get to that, we first need to take a step back and talk about a bigger thing, what's known as the temple. Now, all this sacrificing and honor God could only take place in one location, the temple in Jerusalem. The center of all religious life for Jews. The temple stood as the main center focus. Because Jerusalem, the Jewish people were a theocracy at heart. They believed that God was in charge. So the temple was also a political center. And it was the only place Torah said to go and offer sacrifices, as opposed to other religions that could do whatever they wanted. The temple was the center of it all. Why? Well, here's the thing. Because God was there. God was with them at the temple. It was where heaven and earth met. And this was a big deal. You see, unlike other religions that had to build tall temples that reached to the sky called ziggurats, this is probably what the Tower of Babel story is about, trying to reach the gods in order to try to access them. Here in Jerusalem, the one true God has come down to us and dwells with and among us. We didn't have to go to him, he came to us. And it's here at the temple then that all life flows out of, and where we offer our sacrifices and praise him and thank him for being with us. Now remember a few sessions ago when talking about their history and how the initial building and then destruction, then rebuilding of the temple was such a big part of their lives and history. This is why. It stood at the center of everything. It was the place they could meet face to face with God. It was the public reminder that God was with them. And in Jesus' day, this was a massive, huge, beautiful building. Parts of it still stand today, built by King Herod. And since it was essentially the focal point and center of Judaism and Jewish life, Jesus' words and actions towards it are really important when you read about them in the Gospels. He predicted its destruction, literally, and metaphorically. He judged it by going in and turning over the tables and money changers. This wasn't just an attack on people selling the temple. It was a statement against the whole religious and political system that the temple stood for, and the false puppet king who built it and put his own men in charge of running it. Jesus was speaking against the whole thing. We'll come back to that later. If you don't know or remember what I'm talking about, I'd encourage you to go back and rewatch session 2. I talked about the history of the temple and the fall and the rise of leaders. Now that isn't to say that everyone that ran the temple was bad. In fact, a lot of them were just good people. Let's get into that real quick. The temple was run by men known as priests, the priesthood. The priests came from a tribe known as the Levites. There were 12 tribes that made up Israel. And this was a hereditary job you were born into because of your family lineage. It was their responsibility to serve the temple, to offer the sacrifices, maintain it, collect the tithe, perform the various rites and rituals, the sprinkling of the blood. They ran the worship, okay? They represented people to God and God to the people. They were the go-between. I would come to the temple, meet the priest would go to God for me. Pretty important role. And these priests would serve 2 weeks every year, so there's a lot of them, once every 24 weeks, and then go back to their normal life with 20 to 25 priests working every day, sacrificing all day. Yes, that's a lot of blood and a lot of dead animals. They were essentially butchers. That was their job. They'd butcher meat, eat some of it, give it back to you. And they were worship leaders at the same time. A little weird, but it's what it was. Now, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. They all came from the tribe of Levi, but they weren't all priests. Those that were just normal Levites still served in the temple. Functions like gatekeepers, singers, or administrators, essentially assistants to the higher people who were the priests. And among all of them, the high priest was the highest official and also the highest political person. In the day of Jesus, this was a man named Caiaphas. We read about it in the Bible. As the religious leader, he oversaw the temple and would enter the Holy of Holies once a year and offer the main sacrifice on the Day of Atonement that I told you. So he was responsible to make sure that everyone was forgiven every year. And as a political leader, this role took on huge significance after Israel was no longer a nation with its own king. They would look to the high priest to lead them. He sort of governed the people under Roman authority. So Rome and King Herod, the puppet king, had a vested interest in who this guy was and often tried to put their own person in power to make sure that things got done like they wanted. This created constant tension, mistrust with the system, and is that guy right? Should he be there? It plays out quite dramatically in the gospel stories when Jesus is seen as a threat to Herod as king and to Caiaphas the high priest. Let's go back to the temple and sacrifices for a second. And this is so important in helping us read and understand the Gospels, especially the interactions Jesus had with religious leaders and others. Because the temple was where God dwelt. It was his presence. And it mattered that it be what we'd say is a holy place, set apart, different, especially just for God. And because it was holy, certain things and people were not allowed inside. Only certain types, those who were deemed as clean or pure, could enter the temple and offer sacrifices. So being clean was a big deal in Jesus' day. And they spoke of this idea, this ritual purity a lot, of being clean, of being pure. But please catch this. In Jesus' day, the concept of being clean or pure had nothing to do with morality. It wasn't about sin, disobedience, or being a good person. It was all about who could and could not go to the temple and worship properly. So the laws about clean and unclean that you read in the Torah were not moral laws, as if you were a bad person for touching a dead body or having sex. They were essentially about a temporary change in your status regulating whether or not you could go to the temple. Were you clean enough to go and offer a sacrifice? It didn't speak of whether someone was sinful or, whatever impure things needed to be kept away from that which was sacred or holy. That was the idea. For this season right now, you shouldn't go to the temple. And these laws included food, but also normal, regular parts of life like hygiene, birth, death, sex, going to the bathroom. So again, it didn't make them immoral if you were unclean. It meant you were unfit for the temple service and worship, and sometimes meant you had to be temporarily removed from the community. Oftentimes, this spoke to the priests mainly. The entire book of Leviticus is ultimately for the priesthood, the people that worshiped in the temple. It had nothing to do with whether they were moral or right before God. Impurity could easily be overcome with either a little bit of time or just bathing, except for lepers who were completely unclean. That's a different story. But all over Jerusalem, you can actually see small bathing pools dug into rock called mikvah pools. There are tons of them right around the temple, unsurprisingly, because that's where people were about to enter the temple. They would bathe, ceremonially clean, go to the temple. Becoming ceremonial clean was a big part of their culture. It wasn't about being righteous, it was about worshiping appropriately. But worship was a big part of their lives. Okay, time out for a small little side point, a significant one, but a side point. By the time of Jesus, what we found is that some, but not all, religious teachers had taken the belief or the view that purity was more significant to the personal life, even if you didn't worship in the temple. Certain religious people began to believe that they needed to live clean all the time. Thus, more and more mikvah pools all around grow, even people's homes. But again, this was based on their tradition, not what the Torah actually said. So, when some of those people get mad at Jesus for not being clean enough, washing his hands appropriately, Jesus will shoot back that they're condemning him based on their own traditions, which they have taken too far, not the law itself. And he'll be like, hey, look, clean the inside, buddy. Forget about washing the outside all the time. Look, you're dirty inside. You're missing the point of clean and unclean. It's not about washing your hands. It's about being right before God, right? All right, let's keep moving. That was a side point. While sacrifice, temple worship, and ritual purity were a big part of living under Torah, there were also a lot of other laws that guided and directed their lives. We can't get into all of them. Don't have time, sorry. But I just want to address the big ideas. And it's this. This is the biggest idea. God intentionally, on purpose, gave them some weird, downright peculiar rules to follow for the explicit and exact intention of being different, for the sake of being different. Remember, God called them out from the rest of the world. He wanted them to shine his light to others. He wanted them to stick out like a sore thumb so people would actually see them and see how blessed they were and want to know why. Who are these people? Their lives are great. And they would say, oh, it's because they worship the one true God. We should worship him as well, right? So the Torah is full of all kinds of odd directives that made the Jews stand out. How they were to cut their hair right and what kind of clothes they could wear and what food they could and couldn't eat. Notice, these laws, again, were not about morality, like don't murder, right? That's just wrong. They were laws that separated the Jews from others so they would stand out. So they'd be a city on a hill, a light to the world. God's purpose would be you would see them, they would look different, and you'd want to know why. Now, the biggest physical one was circumcision. They literally bore a physical mark on their body of their belonging to God. That you couldn't, once it was done, you're not going back, right? This was commonly regarded as one of the most essential parts of Jewish practice, because when you circumcised your child, you were saying you're going to raise the boy to be loyal to God. And those who converted to become Jews, they had to get the knife out, right? All Jews were circumcised as a sign of accepting the agreement, as a physical reminder to them and the world around them. Like a wedding ring today, but you can take off your wedding ring. Now you might think, okay, no big deal, whatever, you can put pants on. But if you married a foreign pagan woman, which you weren't supposed to do, you have to explain yourself. And the Greeks, following the Romans, had a common practice of exercising and wrestling and having public games in the nude. And bathhouses were very common. So being a Jew made you stand out in those environments. And it's like, oh, he's a Jew, right? And this would also become a huge issue for the early Christians. Should they get circumcised to be followers of Jesus? Are they becoming Jews? That's another class. Sorry. Maybe we'll do that later sometime. Get into Paul's. But that's a big argument. Okay. So along with food laws, circumcision, other physical laws, another big deal was Shabbat, or the Sabbath as we call it. And the Sabbath is essentially a command to not do any work on the seventh day. Work 6 days, rest the seventh. Okay, big deal. Well, of course you and I have grown up with this one. So yeah, so we only work 5 days, right? Back then, people didn't just take a day off. That was crazy. How could you compete with other businesses when you were taking a full day off? That farmer over there is competing with you for selling at the market, and he's working 7 days. This is a big deal. So most saw this as one of the most unusual aspects of the Jews. These guys take a whole day off of work, right? And not coincidentally, there's writings that show that people were attracted to Judaism because of it. I want to be a Jew. They take a whole day off work. Now, Shabbat is a good example of the challenges Torah could represent because God demands a day of rest and says, do not work. But what exactly does do not work mean? How do you interpret that? Well, people interpret it very differently. Some wouldn't do anything. You can't even defend yourself if you're attacked. You can't take more than 15 steps. Others saw it as more as, just don't go to your job. It was differences of opinions. There was even a law about not starting a fire on the Sabbath, which even still today in Israel, you can see elevators that automatically stop on every floor because the electronics used to choose your floor use a spark, and that's against Torah on the Sabbath. So this was a contentious stuff here. What does it mean? What doesn't it mean? How do you obey Sabbath? What does it look like? Would the Jews honor it or would it face trouble? And with that, we should also know that Shabbat was not a fast from food or a solemn, depressing assembly. Rather, it was a joyous party that they all looked forward to. And non-Jews often envied. They would eat a ton. They just had to cook it the day before. And married couples were actually expected to go home and, right? Sabbath. You are supposed to enjoy the Sabbath because God is good and gave it as a remembrance that life is not all about work. The Jews knew how to celebrate because that was in Torah. Live joyfully because God is good. All right, a few more and we'll kind of wrap up for today. Another big part of Jewish daily life was built around the command to remember. Because obeying God and following the covenant brought blessing, it was important that we remember to obey. If we forget, we'll lose it, right? And we need to teach our children to obey because we're only a generation away from them forgetting and not following. And by the time of Jesus, you had a long history, recorded history of what happened when they didn't obey. So their lives were full of rituals and symbolic actions about honoring God, remembering their agreement. They would actually write it on their doorposts and tie little scriptures to their verses, and they would constantly be talking and teaching their children. And a big part of this was prayer. Now, in many ways, prayer looked for them similar how it looks for us today, going to God, asking for things like you and I pray. But they would also see prayer as a time to remember. Twice a day, the Jews would pray by reciting the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. They'd recite it over and over as a prayer to remind themselves. This was at the core of who they were. So they would say it every day, and they would teach it to their children. One of the first things little kids learned was to say the Shema. Hear, O Israel, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. And they would also seriously study the Torah. This was a big part of their life. Given that it was how they were to live, they needed to know what it said. They needed to learn it. So while the temple was like the White House of Jewish life and religion, not everyone lived near or could go to Jerusalem. And so for this reason, they formed smaller groups in each town and area where Jews could worship and learn the Torah. And they would have regular meetings where it was read and taught apart from the temple. This was a key part of Jewish worship, as they believed even if they couldn't get to the temple to offer a sacrifice, gathering together and studying Torah was worship. They said, wherever 2 or 3 gather together to study Torah, there God is. Jesus would take that verse and choose it. Anyway, and these community centers where they would gather were called synagogues, meaning house of prayer. And we're kind of like what we think of as church today. They would meet for community, to study the Torah, to celebrate, and to live life together. They were not able to offer sacrifices if they were far away from Jerusalem, but this was their sort of expression of Jewish faith, of the common person of the day. And every town would have a synagogue. We found them all over Europe and Asia. Wherever the Jews spread to, there would be a local synagogue where they would gather together and study Torah. And most often they would do this on Shabbat, the Sabbath, since you weren't allowed to work that day anyways. So they would gather together and they would study Torah. Now this brings us to another one of the key players in their day that we read about in the gospel books. People known as scribes or teachers of the law, sometimes known as lawyers. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you recognize that. They commonly interacted with Jesus and sort of show up on the scene in these books. Who were they, and how does this relate to what we're saying here? Well, you need to note that most people in the ancient world couldn't read. There's estimates on this. Some scholars say as little as 3 to 5% of the population could read fluently. And even those who could sort of read and kind of make out script, the scrolls that made up the Old Testament and the Torah were enormous and difficult and fairly rare. You might only have one set in each small town. So how would the people ever know how to obey God in the Torah if they couldn't read it? Well, certain men would dedicate their entire lives to studying and learning so they could teach others. Some of these were priests who were, they only did 2 weeks in the temple and they'd come home and be scribes and teachers. Now, this gave them a certain degree of power and position in the community, which, as we see in the Gospels, didn't always sit well or create some tension sometimes with Jesus. We'll touch on that more later. The big idea, though, was that studying and learning Torah was a regular part of a loyal Jew's life, even if they couldn't read. The community together learned and taught each other. Now, as the society would move forward in the next few centuries, literacy would raise a lot, but at the time of Jesus, most people relied on the teachers and the scribes. Okay, finally, I always think it's important to make sure when talking about the Jewish people that we clarify something. While it's true that when you read the gospel books, Jesus has some tough run-ins with certain religious leaders and sometimes speaks pretty harshly, this doesn't mean that all Jews were bad people they were all hypocritical and selfish and Jesus was just anti-Jewish. He was Jewish. He was a rabbi. And that isn't what the Torah actually teaches. Rather, the Torah would instruct very clearly God's law means living in love, charity, kindness for others, even strangers. And so Jesus' condemnation and confrontation with some leaders and speaking against them wasn't a condemnation on Judaism in general or the law, but those leaders who weren't actually following it. The Torah clearly and specifically calls for loving your neighbor, acting justly, upholding mercy, kindness, generosity. It's a reflection of God's nature. And it's easy to forget that at the core of Judaic belief was that God called them to love their neighbor and be generous and kind because, some of the bad guys in the gospel. So be careful with that. We actually see some amazing examples from other literature outside of the Bible where people are impressed with and amazed by the kindness and compassion of Jews and the way they share and help one another. When it worked, it was amazing, right? The problem, of course, as we see in the Gospels when Jesus shows up, wasn't the problem with the law or obeying Torah. It was that people didn't actually take it to heart. Instead, they took what they wanted or they disagreed and nitpicked over how to properly obey it, sometimes just not even caring and preferring power and status over actually seeing what the law intended. Sometimes even the leaders themselves knew the Torah, but didn't actually let it affect their lives. And that's what Jesus says. He says, do what they say, not what they do, because they're teaching the law and the law is good. So that's the world that we stepped into. All right, let's end there. We'll pick up here next session and talk about the different characters and people groups within Judaism, how they differed and why. Jesus often struggled with some of these guys. So who were they? Who were the Pharisees and the Sadducees? You hear about zealots, different people, the Sanhedrin. I want to talk about these people because they're not just random characters. They're people who disagreed and differed on how to be loyal to God. What does it mean to be ritually clean? What does it mean to be faithful? What will it take for us to make sure that when the Messiah comes, we'll be able to partake in what he brings? So we're going to break down some of the different characters and who these people were next week. We're also going to look at a little bit of who were just normal Jews living in daily life. What did it look like to live in a small Jewish house and be a farmer or a fisherman? We'll kind of unpack some of their daily life a bit more and begin to see more clearly who these people were and the world in which they lived in. So I invite you to join us next session, and we'll see you then. Thanks, guys.